This next lesson is going to cover the amendments. There are 27. Amendments 1 through 10 deal with the Bill of Rights, and these Bill of Rights were necessary in getting the Constitution ratified. When discussing the Bill of Rights, it's important to note that these rights are also known as liberties. Liberties are freedoms that we enjoy that the government cannot restrict from us. It's not as if there aren't some limitations to our liberties, but generally speaking, these liberties represent limitations to government. Let's take a look at Amendment 1. Amendment 1 covers freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. There are two major components to the freedom of religion. The two clauses in the freedom of religion include the freedom of expression, which means that individuals have the right to practice whatever religion they choose, and they also have the right to not practice religion as well. The second clause is the Establishment Clause, and this prevents the government from sponsoring religion, specifically favoring one religion when it comes to government. The next is the freedom of speech. Some restrictions would include obscenity, lying, or defamation. The next one is the right to petition, and this includes being able to place before your government a formal complaint or grievance. Do you ever find people in front of grocery stores trying to convince you to sign their petition? The next one is freedom of the press, and a lot of the same principles apply when we think of freedom of speech, but this specifically applies to the media. The press plays a major role in informing citizens about what goes on within government. They play a major role in keeping people informed. Unfortunately, there is a lot of media out there that is meant to entertain rather than to inform. So it's really important to educate yourself on how to decipher credible media from media that is not credible. Lastly is the right to assemble, and that's connected to the right to protest. This means that people have the right to collectively express, promote, or pursue any of their collective or shared ideals. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. It reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." This amendment is pretty controversial, especially with many of the shootings that have happened at schools in recent years. However, most proponents of gun rights believe that this is a vital right, and being able to protect oneself from someone else or the government is necessary. One of the primary reasons this amendment was included to the Constitution is because citizens needed to be able to organize a militia quickly in case of foreign invasion. Some have argued that a well-regulated militia is no longer necessary since the United States is the strongest military in the world. The Third Amendment deals with the quartering of troops. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Now, this amendment does not so much apply today. It did at the time it was included in the Constitution because of British soldiers quartering in the colonists' homes. However, as I mentioned before, the U.S. military is the largest it's ever been, and there are plenty of bases all over the country and all over the world that can provide housing and food and necessities to soldiers. The Fourth Amendment deals with searches and seizures, so police officers have no general right to search for or seize evidence or arrest persons without a warrant present. Proving probable cause is necessary in obtaining a warrant. Reasonable suspicion, however, has been seen by many as a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but this gives officers the authority to stop an individual and temporarily detain them if they have reason to believe that they've committed a crime, and they cannot immediately obtain a warrant. The Fifth Amendment deals with several rights related to criminal proceedings, due process, and eminent domain. An individual must be charged or indicted by a grand jury to be tried for a crime. This means formal accusations have to be placed before the individual before they can be charged. An individual cannot be charged for the same crime twice. So if they beat a case, meaning that they do not get charged in a trial, They cannot be brought to trial for the same crime again. Next, the right to remain silent. That's attached to your Miranda rights. Many of you are familiar with those. No rights may be denied without due process of law, meaning rights need to be extended to individuals until proven guilty in a court of law before their rights can be denied. And lastly, eminent domain deals with the government taking private public property for legitimate public purpose, but only for fair compensation. So this gets a little tricky. Let's just say the government decides that they need to build a freeway that is going to be constructed through where your home may reside. They can pay you what Zillow has up for what your home is worth, even though to you, maybe it's been in your family for generations. Because that is the monetary value of the home, that's what they can provide you and be able to seize your property for that amount. Next, we have the Sixth Amendment, and this deals with criminal proceedings. This is the right to a speedy trial with an impartial and informed jury. An individual has the right to cross-examine hostile witnesses. So if you are being prosecuted, then you would have a right to be able to defend yourself with witnesses that are favorable to you. You have the right to require testimony of favorable witnesses. Okay, kind of already mentioned that. And the right to an attorney. The Seventh Amendment deals with civil trials, and an individual has the right to a civil trial in federal court if the value in controversy exceeds $20. Adjusted for inflation, that might be closer to $500, but the language of this amendment has not changed. The Eighth Amendment deals with punishment for crimes, so this deals with excessive bail not being required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Just for some perspective, there are a lot of people who believe that capital punishment is an example of cruel and unusual punishment. If you take a look at the map of the United States, you've got three categories here: states with the death penalty, states without the death penalty, and states with a governor-imposed moratorium, meaning that the governor has decided to temporarily put on hold death row inmates that are facing execution. As you see here, most states still practice capital punishment. Now, looking at that in comparison to the rest of the world, you'll notice that most of the free world no longer practices capital punishment. But it is interesting to see that the United States is not quite there. The Ninth Amendment deals with unenumerated rights. What this means is, even though these rights might not be explicitly stated by member in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that citizens still don't enjoy these rights. The 10th Amendment is the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, and this might be regarded as the most important amendment that was added that really sold the states on ratifying the Constitution. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What this means is that if those powers are not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, then the power belongs to the states. The states have the right to make those laws. As a reminder, this amendment often is in conflict with clauses of the Constitution. For example, the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. The 11th Amendment deals with suits against states. A state cannot be sued in a federal court by another country or by one of its own residents, and this was added to further expand and extend state rights. The 12th Amendment deals with the election of president and vice president. Prior to this amendment, if candidates ran for president, the person who won the election became president, and the person who came in second became vice president. Imagine how awkward that would be today. The next three amendments include the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. You learned quite a bit about these amendments in U.S. history. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th extended all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. And the 15th Amendment was the right to vote, and it extended it to individuals regardless of race, color, or servitude. Of these three amendments, the 14th is certainly most important. It really reshaped the Constitution. This is due to two specific clauses, the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. The Due Process Clause allowed for the federal government to now hold states accountable to respecting the Bill of Rights. The Equal Protection Clause has been used to extend civil rights, meaning that individuals would be able to gain protections from the federal government against discrimination. The 16th Amendment allowed for the federal government to collect income tax. The 17th Amendment deals with the election of senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, state legislatures got to choose their senators. That way they had a lot more control over what was favorable to the state as a whole. When we look at the popular election of senators, now we, the people, get to vote on those senators. The 18th Amendment prohibited alcohol. This was later nullified by the 21st Amendment. The 19th Amendment extended the vote to women. The 20th Amendment deals with commencement of terms, sessions of Congress, death or disqualification of the president-elect. It deals with elected officials being sworn in January as opposed to October, and also deals with the possibility of a president-elect dying and who becomes president if the president-elect dies. So in this case, if a president is elected in November, but they're not sworn in until January, if they die between that time frame, then the vice president who is elected gets to serve that position. This also applies to if the president is unable to serve, even if it's not related to death. The 21st Amendment was already mentioned in relation to the 18th Amendment. It repealed the 18th Amendment, and now alcohol is legal. The 22nd Amendment deals with presidential tenure. This means that presidents are expected to serve a maximum of 2 terms. This was respected by tradition, but Franklin D. Roosevelt ended up being elected to a 4th term, and this was not something that a lot of people were very excited about at the time. As we've discussed before, FDR was responsible for implementing programs under the New Deal, and many people saw this to be a huge expansion of the federal government that wasn't necessarily intended for the government to take on. On a side note, one would assume that a president would only be able to serve out 8 years if they were able to get reelected to a 2nd term. However, if a vice president comes into office because a president can't serve and they come in the last 2 years of their term, then that term won't count against them. What that means is they could potentially serve for 10 years max. The 23rd Amendment deals with presidential electors for the District of Columbia. Since the District of Columbia is not technically part of any state, it still needs a number of electoral votes in the Electoral College when deciding on the president. And so those 3 electoral votes come from the least number of votes in any of the states. So smallest population states are going to have 3, 2 senators, 1 representative. The 25th Amendment deals with presidential succession, vice presidential vacancy, and presidential inability. So if the actual president is not able to serve their term, then this means that the vice president is able to take over. So that may have to do with death. It may have to do with the mental stability of the president, but the vice president would take on that role. The 24th Amendment deals with the right to vote in federal elections without taxation. So this was connected to removing poll taxes that were a common practice in the South in preventing African Americans from voting. Many would argue that the vote is still being suppressed today because these elections are run by states. There are ways in which this might happen. And so if we're talking about restrictions on provisional ballots, if we're talking about voter ID laws, those are just a couple of ways in which might be seen as a way to suppress certain minorities from voting. The 26th Amendment federalized the right to vote age at age 18. The last amendment, the 27th Amendment, deals with congressional pay. It reads, "No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened." What this means is that members of Congress have to wait until the next election before they get to enjoy an increase or a bump in their pay. So representatives are elected every 2 years, so they would all be up for that new reelection, whereas senators, only a third of them would be up for that new reelection. So just putting that into perspective. This is the end of our lecture, and hopefully you have a better understanding of the amendments.